Well, hello and welcome to another episode of More Perfect Marketing. It's David Baer here. You know, years ago when I was a kid growing up in New York City, I used to see ads on TV and on the radio for something called Hair Club for Men. You may or may not be old enough to know this, but the ads were all done by the guy who owned the company. His name was Cy Sperling, who I think he passed away at the beginning of COVID. And he had this tagline, which was something like, now I'm trying to remember it. I'm not just the president, but I'm also a client. And that sort of positioning has always intrigued me. The fact that the people who are in a business also have a sense of what the experience of the customer is like as well. And that's really at the core of a really interesting and well-positioned agency that is working in the tech space. And we're going to dive into the makeup of that agency, the idea behind it, how it got started, and what it's doing now. And thankfully, we actually have somebody who's got the inside track on all that. And that's Eli Rubel, who is the owner of Mattermade. Eli, welcome.
Thanks for having me, David. Excited
Yeah.
to dig in.
All right. So I set this up. I don't know. I pulled that story out of the back of my head somewhere, but it's I think relevant given what you have done with your agency. And I wonder if you can sort of walk us through how you've positioned your agency and why.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I first off, I never set out to start an agency. I think that's important context. My first company was a software business, venture backed. We did contract lifecycle management software. And so my experiences of agencies were all initially through that lens of being the CEO of a tech company, hiring, whether it was, 1, 2, 3-person show or a full-blown agency, and feeling frustrated with the experience, feeling like the agencies were built by agency people for agency people to impress other agency people with how nice their, weekly decks looked and vanity metrics and all that. And not that they're intentionally setting out to create that sort of positioning, but when stepping into a fairly niche environment like the tech space, it just wasn't aligned with what I needed as a leader. It didn't feel like they understood the board level pressures, or they didn't understand, what sort of OKRs we were working towards and how they plugged into that picture. They just knew we just keep them happy, we don't get fired, and that's our job, kind of a vibe. And so after, fast forward, that company was acquired in 2014. I went on to acquire and turn around and sell to a private equity firm, an e-commerce business as like a break from tech, and then landed on what I'm doing today with Mattermade, kind of inadvertently, first as a consultant sent in by the VCs to help their portfolio companies grow, but pretty quickly realized that there was a strong fit back to the messaging question, the positioning question. There's a pretty strong fit in building an agency from the ground up that really understood the audience that we would be servicing and could speak their language, had already been in the trenches, in their shoes before, and approached all of the work that we do through that lens.
So just for our audience's understanding, what is I said tech in a very general way, and if you can sort of describe the type of businesses, and I imagine some of the names will be familiar to some folks in our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we work with software companies, tech-enabled businesses, companies like Dropbox, Oracle, Yelp, Loom, Calm. So ranging from, your big, serious, buttoned-up enterprises to fast-growing, early-stage startups.
And so the types of folks that you have brought onto your team come from those types of environments. Is that my understanding?
They do, yeah. More so on the startup side, not so much on the enterprise side. I think it's really key that these people understand and have felt the same pressures that our clients are feeling. And so we can come in from day one speaking the same language and communicating in the same way.
So you made a point of saying mostly in the startup rather than the enterprise. Can you talk a little bit about what somebody who's playing a marketing role in a startup in this software enabled tech company? Is that the phrase that I heard?
I said software or tech enabled, but
Okay, got it.
generally it's software
Mhm.
companies. Yeah.
So
Yeah. So
yeah, go ahead.
to your question, um, startup marketers who are in a startup environment tend to have to wear more hats. They tend to have to understand more of the business and more of the marketing world than just their swim lane. Even if, let's say they're a performance marketer. If they're a performance marketer at a 100-person tech startup versus a performance marketer within a division of Oracle that is 100 people just in performance marketing, like the blinders and the amount of context that they're learning beyond just their one thing is much greater in a smaller environment. And so for us, because we work with a lot of companies of that size on the startup side, I find that those folks are a bit more nimble when it comes to collaborating with other groups within the business and understanding the bigger picture, as opposed to being excellent subject matter experts within a very specific swim lane. And likewise, when when the large companies come to us, like the Oracles, like the Dropboxes, like the Yelps of the world, they come to us to help them behave more like startups. Right. So they're looking for that edge. They're looking to understand what small companies who can move really quickly are doing at the tip of the spear in marketing.
That's a whole other podcast episode about how you apply that kind of thing to an organization that probably has a lot of, compartmentalized teams. But it's interesting, as you were talking about what a startup goes through. It's we have a lot of small business owners in our audience, very much the same sort of situation that a lot of them are going through. They're constantly being distracted by other needs and other pressures. And I imagine that, the ability to be a marketer who has a general idea of what's going on in the business, what the implications of moving in one direction, or positioning around something, or going after a certain audience segment that maybe wasn't the natural, direction initially, right? Those are all the types of things that I imagine you guys are um, uh, a a database of among your team.
Yeah. I mean, people, if you think about our customer, really just, you could abstract some of the terms I'm about to use and really make it about any industry. But in our industry, you might have folks who are trying to solve a lifecycle marketing problem or a paid media problem or a brand problem. But that's not actually that's the agency lens. We're trying to place, what services do we have that will solve their problem? They don't have a lifecycle marketing problem or a brand problem or a paid media problem. They have a revenue problem, or they have a growth problem, or there's some sort of fundamental North Star metric that they're sitting at a board table with their investors going, this is a problem. How do we solve it? And then lifecycle marketing, brand, those are really like strategies and tactics. But if you're coming at those conversations as an agency thinking that's the end all be all, you're missing the bigger picture. And then there's also so much connective tissue between how brand marketing interacts with lifecycle marketing, interacts with performance marketing. And so if you put your blinders on and just say we're focused on this one Lego block, you're shooting yourself in the foot for the amount of impact you could have with that organization. And you're also limiting your strategic value and showing that business that you really don't care to understand their business. You just care to solve this one problem and charge them for it. It's more transactional.
I love the way that you started that line of thinking. In our business, we often talk about, we share this mutual understanding that marketing service providers have challenges around the way that they operate and are set up. And you've addressed one problem, we address a different problem, but the thing that they share is the point that you made about, it's really a revenue issue from the business's point of view. And so something that we talk about quite a bit with marketers who we support is their ability to effectively talk to, the chief revenue person, whether that's the head of finance or some other role in a business, and it's often in small businesses, all one person who's running it, the person who's thinking about the money, right? That marketer is going to separate themselves from all the other marketers out there who talk about all the things that you laid out, earlier, all the tactical things and all of the sort of industry specific jargon to the marketing world. So I love that approach. Okay, so now I'm gonna switch things up, because I jump on your website, mattermade.co, which is a super cool looking site, and I'm greeted by demand efficiency. Now, I'm a guy from, direct response marketing and the small business world. And so this is language that I'm not terribly familiar with. I know the phrase, and we've talked about on the show before, demand generation. But talk a little bit about what is demand efficiency.
Yeah, for sure. So demand efficiency was actually a term that we coined at the end of last year because we looked at the industry. There's a ton of pressure on companies to reduce cost to acquire. And that seems like an obvious statement for people who are listening who are non-technical in the marketing realm. Cost to acquire is essentially how much money do you have to pay to acquire a customer. Because we're shifting from a time where, especially in tech, it was growth at all costs. There's opportunity. Everybody was, out there, bull market, trying to acquire as many customers as possible, not as concerned about the cost and the earn back and the lifetime value. Still things they cared about, but not as much. Now, with the market kind of flipping, everyone's really obsessed with how do we reduce our cost to acquire. And the challenge there is marketing is already a black box to non-marketing executives. We don't have any leading indicator for reducing cost to acquire. You basically, as the marketing executive, have to say, here are all the things I'm going to do to reduce cost to acquire. You're just going to have to trust me and wait for a quarter or two. And in 1 to 2 quarters, hopefully, some of these will be correct hypotheses, and hopefully we will see the cost to acquire go down. And so that's a big pill to swallow for non-marketing executives. And there is no leading indicator in the meantime of if they're tracking towards success. So we looked at that and looked at our portfolio of customers going back, the past 3 years to say, is it possible to create a leading indicator? Is it that someone just hasn't really sat down and created the framework to understand, very much objectively, we are tracking towards a reduction in cost to acquire because of these actions that we've taken, and we're tracking the right direction, give people a little bit of a heads up. And so demand efficiency was this term we coined, and we created this demand efficiency framework where a company can self-assess and say, it takes about 5 minutes. They go through a series of questions and they can say, okay, here are the things we're doing. Here are the things we aren't doing. It's very, question answer based. And then it actually produces a score and compares them to peers in their industry by industry, fundraising amount, like all of the different selling motion, so that they can understand, okay, maybe they thought they were doing really well on the demand efficiency front, and then come to find out there's actually a lot of room to improve if they're comparing themselves against their peers. And so kind of value on the demand efficiency front in twofold. One, to understand how you stand against your peers, but two, and more importantly, to create an environment internally where everyone understands how we're tracking towards reducing cost to acquire and getting more efficient in the way that we acquire customers.
So they work through a process of identifying their score in this setup that you've created for them. How do you then identify what specific activities need to be engaged? And maybe, you can illustrate this in a, sort of example if possible.
Yeah, for sure. So when people talk about, I'll even take a step back to, you mentioned demand gen earlier, demand generation. So typically when the talking heads go on to talk about demand generation, they talk about demand capture and demand creation. So you're either going out through Google or other channels to capture people who are already know they have a problem and are looking for a solution. That's demand capture. Then demand creation is, hey, there's probably a segment of the market that doesn't necessarily know that there's a solution to their problem, or maybe they haven't really clarified what their problem is, but they know they have one. And so that's when you're actually going in and educating those folks, taking them along a journey, getting them to a point where they've realized their problem, they've clarified it, and now they're ready to look for a solution. So one of them is more like a long play, and the other one is a now term play. But and then those two pieces are usually what are talked about when we talk about demand gen. What's missing from that equation is all of the other marketing surfaces that ultimately add up to your cost to acquire and your close won rates, right? So it's not just go out and capture existing demand, groom future demand. It's how does the handoff between sales and marketing look? How are we handling our life cycle emails and nurtures? What does the buyer experience and buyer journey look like? There are hundreds of conversion points from first brand impression through to closed won customer, retention, renewal, and upsell. And when marketers get laser focused on demand gen, they tend to ignore all of those other surfaces, all of those other points of conversion, typically because they feel like smaller wins. They don't feel like the big lever that you're going to pull. And, I think most non-marketers think that marketing is like, we just need to find our one silver bullet and then we're good. And couldn't be further from the truth. And the only times it's like just dumb luck and opportunity timing, just you fall into something, but typically it's a lot of little wins that make the difference, as I'm sure you know. And so demand efficiency essentially takes that same stance of a lot of these conversion points might not drive 20% of your volume this year. But if there are 50 different opportunities to improve your conversion rate by 1%, there's 50% increase in, conversion efficiency. So it's the encouragement and bringing awareness to all of these little dark corners of the customer journey that on aggregate can drive incredible cost savings and efficiency.
There's something I think very instructive about that, because I think every business has a similar setup. And while you're using terms that, may be new to our listeners, and some of those are new to me as well, all of the stuff that you've described in terms of the relationship between a future customer prospect and a business, that's been, the case for, well over a century in terms of the way that marketing happens, and the decision-making process and the conversions and all of that. We just use different language these days to discuss it, I think. So but the question, about the little incremental improvements in all these different places, I think is very broadly applicable. And just this morning, I was in our mastermind going through training from somebody who was talking about subscription programs, business models of subscription. And obviously in the software-based or SaaS space, a lot of those businesses are built on subscription. And the things that happen to engage somebody right when they buy that are going to guarantee a longer relationship, rather than, looking into the future at the average, separation point. On average, we keep our subscribers for 10 months. Well, great. Let's around month 8 start doing something to make sure that they stick around. But if you actually look at the numbers, this was the point of the presentation we saw, a huge amount of the attrition happens well before month 8, and so you've lost that opportunity. So what you're saying is, look at all of these moments in time to see where there's opportunity to adjust things, to make little improvements here and there, which all add up. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, totally. I mean, a simple analogy would be, if you reserve a room at a Four Seasons versus going to a Dollar Tree motel or something like that, the Four Seasons experience starts well before your booking and ends after you leave, right? Like well after you leave. And there's all of these different experiences that they've optimized, like physically, digitally, so that on aggregate, you're like, wow, that was an incredible experience. And like, maybe you can't put your finger, it's not that the food was really good or that it just as that one thing, or it wasn't that the view was just so crazy as compared to anywhere else you've been, but it was all of the things on the whole that created this amazing experience. And so it's the same thing with marketing, right? There's just folks tend to ignore a lot of the little details, and they matter.
So for a business that is applying this themselves, or a marketer who's sitting out there listening to us going, oh, I really should be helping my clients pay more attention to these areas. What is your advice in sort of the process for investigating, what all of the opportunities might be and how to prioritize them?
Yeah, I mean, so when we do, so first off, the demand efficiency framework, the analysis, all of that is free and available on our website, but it's most likely only relevant for companies that are, relatively high growth tech companies, probably have taken on some outside capital or private equity backed. And I only say that because the language we use there is very familiar to those industries and would probably be unfamiliar to industries outside of that. If I were to try to translate what we have there and that framework into more generic terms, you really, I mean, it's hard to break the whole thing down and summarize. It would be looking at your buyer journey from start to finish and breaking it down, through categories like, where are we first acquiring people? How are we acquiring them? Do we have what platforms and tools do we have to measure and attribute where folks are coming from? Usually that's missing for even some of the best companies out there, don't have that full picture. And so, it's not very sensible to invest a ton of dollars or time into programs if you can't actually see how well they're impacting your results. So it's like, okay, how does your tech stack and kind of foundation look? Then we're getting into, okay, once you have folks in your realm of awareness, what do your nurture programs look like? How are you communicating with those people and adding value to them once they're in your world? Then there's a section about, how well do you actually understand your customer? Are those insights driven by executives at your company based on their gut or based on objective testing in market? A lot of companies, again, even very, very successful ones that, logos people would know the names of, a lot of their decisions around product marketing and positioning are based on executive gut and not based on, hey, we went into the market, we ran some experiments, and, based on these results, we actually know that this type of buyer is interested in this type of language and this type of message and this type of value creation. And therefore our campaigns are going to use that language rather than, the CEO said so. So that's what we're doing. Keep going down through the, so we're mid funnel now. Now we go to bottom of funnel. What's the handoff between marketing and sales look like? Is there a standard process there that's been written down and agreed upon by those two groups? Do the two groups meet regularly to discuss? There's a lot of insights that come from sales conversations that marketing never hears about because they threw their thing over the fence and they, air quotes, did their job, which of course isn't true. And so the tighter that partnership can be, and the more you have weekly stand-ups on, on the calendar repeating, where those two groups are passing intel back and forth, and the sales conversations can then influence the marketing campaigns, et cetera, the better. So now we're at, bottom of funnel, point of conversion. Then we're getting into retention. You have, customer success people and understanding how are they actually getting value from, whether it's your product or service in this case. How can that value be translated back into more brand and product marketing for the top of the funnel? Down through retention. And this is going to get weird because I'm used to talking about this in terms of software companies as opposed to services companies, but you see where I'm going with this, right? It's like an evaluation where you start and go all the way through that journey and think about all of those different touch points and be really critical and not dismissing things that feel too small. Because again, it's funny when I'll get on, I was on with the chief marketing officer at a publicly traded company the other day talking about demand efficiency, and they had just finished completing that evaluation. And they said, it's funny, a lot of these things we're doing well, but a lot of them we kind of have let go by the wayside. But when you take this evaluation and see all at once how much low-hanging fruit there is that could be handled, one-off, they feel like one-offs, but when it's all stacked in front of you, it really feels like a solid corpus of work that could improve demand efficiency and cost to acquire.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think you did a bang up job, by the way, translating to lay terms for the average business. And so kudos to you for that. And that's exactly what I think we experience with a lot of the businesses that we end up working with are the things that I think the phrase was, avoiding dismissing things that don't seem to be, significant or important. But it's often those things, and in your Four Seasons, story, I imagine that there's a lot of little things that you don't pick up on as the guest, but it might be the way that something was communicated or presented, or the fact that there was, a finer quality paper or card in the materials that they hand you at the, when you check in. That sort of stuff really matters to the customer in a way that it probably contributes to a subsequent transaction or
Yep.
several.
Yep.
And I imagine you see that a lot in your world too. So it makes total sense. I'm now keen to see this whole breakdown on your website, and maybe we'll figure out how to translate it together for a broader market. In terms of how you ended up here, I know you have a sort of a fascinating and very indirect route into the business that you're currently running. But I picked up on something that I heard you say in another interview recently, that you maybe not started out, but you have a history as somebody who was studying art and
That's right.
and eating ramen, as I think you put it. And that's really a journey from there to this point. I wonder if you can give us sort of a quick breakdown on that, and then we'll make sure that folks know where they can find you to learn more.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the quick version of that story was I was convinced from a very young age I was going to be a photographer. I went to photography school for about a year before dropping out, moved down to LA to pursue art full time. Had some shows, some exhibitions in museums, and was having a lot of success on paper, but not having a lot of success making money from my art. And so I had what I call my quarter life crisis, where I read The 4 Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss and realized, hey, I'm young enough. I can learn this thing, the internet that everybody's talking about, and make a business for myself. And then I'll, make money and come back to my art and essentially use the world of entrepreneurship to fund my artistic endeavors. And so I quit my job. I moved into my mom's basement, and I gave myself this challenge. I was 21 at the time, 21 at the time. Basically said, I'm not allowed to leave my mom's basement until I've started a software company. And then fast forward 6 months, I raised some venture capital, and was off to the races.
And so I'm curious, is your life, your professional life, now funding your adventures?
It is indeed funding my adventures. I wouldn't call myself a photographer anymore. I left the art world and didn't go back to it, but it certainly is funding fun adventures out in the world.
I think one of the greatest things about getting to chat with people is discovering that there's a lot of really great information that they've amassed in terms of all the professional knowledge and capabilities they have, but I'll also remember that there's an interesting person behind that. And so thank you for sharing a little bit of insight into the interesting person in you.
Yeah, thanks, David.
So if folks are interested in looking at that framework on your website, learning more about what you do and the folks you serve and the type of work that you do in general to support them, where can they find out more?
Yep, they can go to mattermade.co, and up in that top nav bar, if they're interested in learning more about demand efficiency, there's a resources tab that has a lot more information.
Excellent. Well, perfect. We will, of course, have a link to mattermade.co in the show notes, as well as other places where they can find you. Eli
Fantastic.
Rubel, thank you so very much for hanging out with me. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, it was fun, David. Thanks for having me.
Indeed. Folks, if you enjoyed this conversation and know someone else who could benefit from hearing it, please, by all means, share it. I'm David Baer, and this is More Perfect Marketing. Thanks for hanging out with us. Take care.